Hi and welcome to Jessie James Beads. My name is Jem and today we're here to celebrate A Midsummer Night's Dream, the July 2025 Magical Mystery Bead Box. Magical indeed. Inspired by the Shakespearean play of the same name, A Midsummer Night's Dream is a beautiful collection of the most magical beads and much, much more. Today I'm masquerading as Queen Titania. A little bit anyway. Let's head down to the board and we will make some beautiful jewellery together today. In this video we'll be working from the Magical Mystery Bead Box for July 2025, A Midsummer Night's Dream, the most magical collection of beads from us here at Jessie James Beads. We have a beautiful gemstone cabochon here called Making Mischief. I'll also be working perhaps with a few leaves from Enchanted Forest and some pieces from the Queen Titania bead mix. In addition to that, I'll be utilising these headpins in our design. For our wire today, we're going to be working with silver colour copper wire in an 18 gauge round. This is a medium temper wire. In order to make this wire work best for you, it really does pay to give that a smooth and a warm through. So I'm going to run that between thumb and forefinger 4 or 5 times just to get some fluidity into that piece of wire. Now, if you pop that on the back of your hand, you will soon be able to tell if you've warmed it because it will be toasty to the touch. You can use round nose pliers, multi-step bail makers, or like myself, you can utilise your memory wire finishing pliers to create a spiral. So I'm going to create about 3/4 of a circular form using the smaller side, which is a 2mm pin, on those pliers, but as I say, you can use whichever round pliers you prefer. I'm then going to generate a spiral slowly and gently to create a really beautiful double track of wire. So we start, we go around once, we go around a second time. Then what I'm going to do is just pull that away just a little bit so that there's a fairly firm bend in the wire just at the edge of that circle, giving that a little bit of a warm. The next thing we're going to do is find the hole on our cabochon. It's actually quite a large drill hole. I tried with 16 gauge and that will go through. It's a really good drill aperture. So what I'm going to do is to pop the centre of my spiral over the top of that hole and hold that into position whilst I draw the wire across towards the back of that cabochon. Once I've reached the back, I'm going to put a very sharp angle over to one side. Now at this point things are going to wiggle around, so don't worry about it if that comes out of position. You can see we've got a small length of wire between the spiral and that angle change. I'm going to warm through that wire again, and you can either press the cabochon down onto a firm but smooth surface. Don't use a hard surface. I've got some paper here which just protects all of my gemstones from damage. So you can pull the wire around the outside of that cabochon to create a form that is just slightly larger than the cabochon itself. If you really struggle with this, you could use a round form such as this Beadalon wooden mandrel and just create an arc where you think it might need to be. Pop your cabochon back into position and then work from there, and you can see it does some of the work for you. So that's certainly a way in which you can make this next part a little bit easier. But if you warm that wire through, you will find it's really very, very willing to generate those beautiful smooth arcing shapes. So I'm just going to hold that over the top of the project. And what we want is to allow some space around the edge of that cabochon. We don't want it to be too tight. So once we've got that basic shape, what we're going to do is to tie the section of wire that's just here above that double spiral to that little angle change that we made. Now to use this, I'm going to use a little length of some 24 gauge silver colour wire. Now this again is a medium to firm temper. It's quite springy, but that's helpful because it's a very firm grip that we need to have on that wire. So to begin with, I'm going to run the tail end of the finer gauge wire about 3 times around the shoulder on that oval form we've created. So if that catches the end of your fingertips, you can certainly use a pair of pliers to get that into position, and I'll show you how now. So I'm just going to use the flat face on my bent chain nose pliers to just make sure that that sticky uppy end bit sits down against the heavier gauge wire. So if I flip that over, you'll see that we can't really detect where that end happens. Now ideally we'd like that end cut to be inside the boundary created by this oval form, but don't worry if it isn't, because you take a moment to squish it down, it's not a problem. So let's just draw that wire across the top of the cabochon, and then we'll scoot that little spiral of wire until we get up close and personal with that angle change section. Let me drop that cabochon out of position for a moment. So what we're looking to do is to tie this section of wire to this section of wire, and we're going to use a figure of 8 weave. So the finer gauge wire is coming from underneath the long tail, so I'm going to bring it over the top of what we're going to call the angle change. So it's just the space between the spiral and where we start creating that oval. So again, the oval does need to be a little larger than your cabochon. We need some space here. So I'm going to draw that finer gauge wire around the angle change, draw it up in between those 2 parallel-ish lines. I'm not going to worry overly if they're not perfectly parallel. We've got a little bit of wiggle room. Now we've just got 1 wrap of wire here, so what we need to do is to check that everything is where we want it to be. Now that's a little bit more baggy than I'd like it to be, so what we're going to do is just pull that across until it sits how I want it to. 2 things we're looking for: a bit of space between that wire frame and the cabochon, and we're also looking for that circular start point, that little aperture in the middle of the spiral, to sit over the top of that hole in the cab. Doesn't matter if it's exact, as long as it's kind of allowing that to be seen through. So we're going to do that little figure of 8 weave, which means we're going to take the finer wire over the top of the tail of wire, up in between the 2 parallel lines, and then down over the top of the angle change. We're going to repeat that a couple of times, and this is a very functional piece of weaving. It's a very easy piece of weaving to get your hands used to doing. So it's called a figure of 8 because if you look at it from this angle, the weave as you create it looks like a figure of 8. So if you can keep that in mind whilst you're doing this weave, it becomes a lot simpler. Now I'm just going to compress that weave to make it as tidy as possible. And we're looking to fill that section of angle change with weaving. And if you get 3 wraps or 4 wraps on either side, that's enough to create that connection point. So I think I've got let's see, 5 points of contact. So what I'm going to do now is to wrap 5 times up at the top here. So that's a 4th time and a 5th time. Now I just had a piece of scrap 24 gauge wire. It was no longer than 8 inches, but as you can see we cut a fair bit away, so you don't need a huge amount of wire for this technique. So we're going to check that the end pieces don't stick up. I'm just going to give them a smooth down. We're also going to check that this sits in position. So there is a little bit more space than I'd like just here. So what I'm going to do is pull very softly on the end of that wire to tighten it up. Very small movements will get you much, much more satisfaction than large movements. Large movements tend to deform the shape that you're looking for. So now that's sitting exactly where I want it to. What I'm going to do is very softly grip on those 5 little wraps up at the top, put that underneath the light directly, and turn that upwards so that that can become our bail for Queen Titania's Fae pendant. So you can see that this is what we have achieved thus far. We've got a little surround for our cabochon, and we have got the hole created by that spiral, that open-centered spiral, lining up with the hole on the cabochon itself. To connect these two pieces together, we are going to use one of these head pins, and it really is a wonderful chance to be able to work with these again. So there are two varieties in my Magical Mystery Bead Box July 2025. You've got this gorgeous starburst, and then you've got this almost lily-like head pin. They're both beautiful. I think today we're going to work with the lily-like head pin. And what we're going to do is to push that through that double spiral and through the hole in the cabochon. And this is how we're going to connect those two pieces together. So let's push that as far as it will go through. And then on the rear side, don't worry about it flopping around for a moment, we're going to pull that tail of head pin sharply upwards. If I return you to the front of the design, you can see how that is starting to look. So I need to pull that to the side. As you can see, we've got an offset bail just here. And what we're going to do then is hold the surround or the frame around the outside of that cabochon evenly whilst we bring the tail all the way around that upright that is going to form part of our bail. So we're wrapping over the top of that finer gauge, that 24 gauge wire that we used a moment ago. So I've just gone for 3 wraps there, and I'm going to trim away the excess of that head pin, making sure that I don't drop that anywhere I'm going to stand on it. So this is the first part of Queen Titania's Fae pendant already done. We're going to create a very unusual type of bail today. It's the sort of bail that one might wear utilising a piece of ribbon, and I thought that aesthetic really worked with the idea of Queen Titania. So I'm also going to employ another one of those beadle-on wooden mandrels just to create a nice arch shape up at the top of the design, just bringing that wire around underneath, which I'll flip over and show you. So we're just making a little bit of an arch up at the top there. So I show you that from the front. That's going to look really, really pretty. What we're going to do now is to just make a little bit of a swirl with the tail of wire we still have available. Get a little bit of warmth and heat into it. And what we're looking to do is just get some stability on the rear side of the design. So I'm going to draw the wire over to one side, pinch that, draw the wire over to the other side, pinch on the other side, and then bring that around one more time. So I could trim a little bit of that away, or I could put a spiral on the rear just here, and that's what I think I'm going to do. So again, when you're making spirals, if you want them to all have the same size middle, utilising a marker pen on your round nose pliers or these wonderful memory wire finishing pliers is really helpful to ensure that those holes in the middle are all the same size. So I'm just going to spiral that around just a little bit. I might tighten that up slightly and make sure that it sits over the rear surface of that cabochon very softly if you're ever putting the tips of your pliers against the gemstone itself. So I have a scrap now of that 24 gauge silver colour wire, and what I'm going to do is choose a couple of points to tie this little zigzaggy section of wire to the back of that design and to the frame. So it doesn't need to be over and over again, it doesn't need to be a huge amount. What we're going to do is to pick a point, and I think I'm going to pick this point, wrap that wire 3 times around the connection point. So because this is a slightly springier wire, I would normally be working with a 26 gauge wire, but I've elected to work with a slightly heavier wire because it gives us that extra strength. So I've got 3 wraps on that zigzag of wire on the back of the design. I'm just going to trim away that end section. And then we're going to make sure that that sits smooth against the heavier wire that forms that little zigzag. So we'll give that a bit of a squish just to make sure it's smooth down. And then we're going to draw that to the rightmost as you're looking at it. And then we're just going to connect that onto the frame on the rear of the design. So I'm going to take that wire over the top of the zigzag and over the top of the frame. And I'm going to draw that around probably 1 time, just making sure that the zigzag remains on the rear side of that cabochon and doesn't peek over the top. So let's just get that last little sticky uppy bit out of the way. It's being very naughty. I think I might just trim that away. And there we go, problem solved. Give that a squish. And I'm going to bring that wire around one more time on the frame, making sure that the zigzag doesn't peek forwards. Tighten up that little spiral, and you can choose how many times you spiral around that frame as you prefer. But what we need to do is to return back to the zigzag on the back of that wire and get a really nice triple rotation so that everything is nice and secure. So I've wrapped 3 times around the excess of S bend on the back, a couple of times around that frame, tighten that up neatly, and then 3 times again around that little tail of wire. So again, we'll need to just trim that section away. And that was 24 gauge silver colour medium temper wire. And it was just a scrap length of a couple of inches. So let's make sure that that sits down again smoothly. What I will do next is to repeat that technique just at the end and probably just at the point that it crosses over to give some stability to that unique little bail that we're going to use. So I'll just get on with that and I'll meet you back in a second. So when I tied the first section of that bail to the frame, I had quite a long piece of that 24 gauge wire. So I thought what I would do is just wrap that around the bail itself. So this is a wrapped bail. I think it looks really pretty and it just adds a little bit of extra detail. And this pendant is going to feature quite a few details. So in a moment I'll show you how you can add some of the Queen Titania bead mixes and maybe even add in some of those leaves to the outside of this beautiful Queen Titania fae pendant. I've attached a piece of wire probably about 18 inches in length, and this again is 24 gauge silver colour copper wire. And what I did was I just used it as an opportunity to tie that last little bit of S-bend to the frame. Now I have the wire coming forwards, and what I'm going to do is put that up the underside of one of these beautiful butterflies from that Queen Titania bead mix and just draw that to sit around the outside. Now you will, by the nature of this technique, be able to see a little bit of that wire, but because it's a lovely silver wire, I'm not overly worried. There'll also be just a little bit of movement. Now you do need to be gentle when you're working with beads in this fashion. So I'm going to push the tail of the wire between that cabochon and the frame of our pendant and just push that all the way down. Now this is a completely optional extra to having the pendant as it already stands. And then we're just going to add a little butterfly around the outside. So without pulling very hard on that bead, what I'm now going to do is rotate that wire a couple of times around just the frame. So just bring that down without putting pressure on the wire that holds the butterfly in position. Scoot that little wrap up into position, and then I'm going to wrap for a second time just to set the position of that butterfly on the frame. So don't let your wire tell you what it's going to do. You need to tell the wire what it's going to do. We're going to tighten up that little double coil without putting any pressure on the butterfly. The reason we want that to be loose is we want this to move around in the light, and that's another reason we've gone for just a slightly heavier wire than one might normally use. So I think what I'm going to do here is add a third wrap around that frame of the pendant. And then maybe we will go for one of those beads as well, or perhaps a leaf. Let's see what it looks like adding a leaf onto the design. And let's just bring that into position. Oh, I think that's going to look lovely. So the finer gauge wire is coming around the outside of that frame of the pendant. So therefore I need to take the tail of the wire inside that frame, in between the frame and the cabochon itself. So very, very softly control that wire into position. And then if you want that leaf at a jaunty angle, go for it. But again, I would say just leave that a little bit loose so it can move around slightly. So I'm going to again go for a double wrap just to set the position on that piece before I consider what I want to do next. And I think maybe a third wrap in this instance is the answer. And there we go. So what I'm going to do is continue in much the same vein, adding a few more of these pieces from that Queen Titania bead mix onto the Queen Titania Fae pendant. It's going to be using that same technique, using the 24 gauge round silver colour copper wire, and then I'll take a photograph and leave it on the outro screen for you. Today we've been working with the Jessie James Beads Magical Mystery Bead Box for July 2025, which is A Midsummer Night's Dream.